Sometimes clarity does not arrive as a complete plan. Sometimes it arrives as a direction. You know what you need to do before you understand why you need to do it, before you know where it'll lead, before you can explain it to anyone else. That's what happened to me when I made the decision to go to seminary. I had no plan to become a minister. I didn't know exactly what seminary was even. But one day, during a quiet moment of meditative prayer, I sensed something very clearly, and it was to go to seminary. And somehow, before my mind could catch up with what was happening, something in me had already said yes. And this is the story of the first purpose calling I consciously recognized and immediately followed. And looking back, it taught me something I would understand much more deeply over time. And this is it. Sometimes you're given the next direction before you're given the whole story. So welcome back to another episode of the Leadership Purpose with Dr. Robin podcast. I'm so glad you're here and listening into the podcast. And in this series, I am tracing some of my major career decisions one at a time. All right, so now let me tell you what happened in this particular part of my career decision journey. I was still working as a social worker, and you may recall that from the last episode that where I talked about the experience with the two little girls who were sisters and what that experience helped me recognize. So at this time, I cared deeply about making a difference. I cared about serving people, but I was also beginning to understand that caring about a cause and being aligned with the work itself were not necessarily the same thing. I was learning something about what was missing for me. But while all of that was happening professionally, something else was happening within me. My mother had died suddenly from a heart attack, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this episode talking about grief because that's not what this particular story is about. But I do think it's important to say here that after my mother's death, my inner world became so hard to ignore. I entered a season of restlessness, and it wasn't an ordinary restlessness. It wasn't boredom or impatience. It was much deeper than that. There was a spiritual yearning in me that I could feel, but not yet interpret. I knew something was happening. I just didn't know what it meant. I talked with my minister about it. I also spoke with another woman minister who was also like a mentor to me. And I think one of the gifts both of them gave me was that neither of them tried to solve it for me. They just listened and they encouraged me to pay attention and to keep paying attention. And so I did. During that time, my spiritual appetite was becoming stronger and stronger. I wanted more teaching, more conversation, more understanding. I found myself wanting to go deeper intellectually and spiritually. And at the same time, something else was bubbling up, was surfacing in me. I was drawn to speaking. I was drawn to teaching. I was fascinated by language. I would watch speakers on television, and of course, I was interested in what they were saying, but I was really paying attention to something else. I was fascinated by communication itself. I listened to how people shaped an idea, how they told a story, how they delivered a message, and how words could move from one person to another and create understanding, emotion, or change. But at the time, I didn't connect my spiritual hunger with my fascination with speaking and teaching. They were simply different things happening inside of me. I didn't yet know how the pieces fit together. I only knew something was growing, something was building. And this is important because we often expect clarity to arrive in a neat sequence. Something like, first I understand who I am, then I know where I'm going, Then I make a plan. Then I take the next step. But that's not always how it happens. Sometimes the pieces appear before the pattern does. You notice that you keep returning to a certain subject, or you become more interested in something you can't quite explain, or you feel pulled towards certain conversations or experiences, and something in you inside becomes more alive. But there's no clear story yet. There's no neat explanation. That was the season I was in. I could feel things moving inside of me, but I couldn't tell you what they meant. Then, one day, the pattern broke through the surface. I was watching a speaker on television, and the speaker was telling a story about a man in ancient times who was called by God to go to another city and serve the people there. In the story, the man was reluctant at first, but eventually went. And I remember having some dramatic reaction to the story. Nothing about the moment seemed especially unusual, except that I suddenly felt the urge to get quiet and pray. And it was not a simple, polite thought like, oh, maybe I should pray. It felt like a strong pull. So I did. I got quiet and I prayed. And I didn't really ask for anything. I just remained in silence with a posture of, I am here and I am listening. And then something happened that I still remember very clearly, like it was yesterday. I suddenly felt a deep connection with God and sensed very clearly go to seminary. That was it. Go to seminary. I didn't know what had just happened. I had heard the word seminary before, but to tell you the truth, I really didn't even know exactly what it was. And I had never imagined myself becoming a minister or anything like that. So I could not place this experience into any plan I had for my life or career. There was no obvious next chapter waiting in my mind, but somehow, before my mind could catch up with what was happening, something in me had already answered. I had already decided that I was going to go to seminary as soon as I could figure out what it was. Side note, later I did find out that the seminary is where people go if they are going to become ministers, and that's the basic degree. It's typically a Master of Divinity degree. So I found that out later. But at the time, I had no idea what seminary was. All right, so now let me tell you about the decision. And the way it happened doesn't mean the decision was easy. There's an important difference between knowing what you believe you need to do and not feeling any pain about what it will cost. In the days and weeks that followed that experience, I spoke with my minister, and then for months, talked about it, thought about it, prayed about it, searched, and several months later, I was on my way to pursue this next path. But going meant leaving. I was leaving my family, my friends, my hometown, a place I love so much. I was leaving what was familiar to me and moving away from a sense of home and community that had nurtured me throughout my entire life up until that point and that I loved everything about. And that was painful. Sometimes when we tell these stories about following a calling, we make the story sound neater in hindsight than it felt while we were living it. We talk about courage, we talk about faith, we talk about saying yes, but sometimes saying yes to one thing means grieving what you're leaving behind, and both can be true. I felt strongly that I wanted and needed to go in order to be true to who I was. And at the same time, I was deeply, deeply sad about leaving. One did not cancel out the other. I was being guided by a conviction of my spirit, which I now understand as one of my top core values. That inner conviction really mattered to me. I couldn't fully explain where leaving home was going to lead. I didn't have a picture of the outcome. I didn't know that this decision would become part of a much larger story about teaching, speaking, purpose, and calling. I just knew I needed to go. And so I went. Now, what I understand now, looking back, is that this decision taught me something that has become important in how I understand purpose. A purpose calling often begins before the story makes sense. You may feel the pull long before you can explain it. You may see individual pieces long before you can see a pattern. And this is what happened to me. The spiritual hunger was one piece. The desire for teaching was another piece. My fascination with speaking was another. But at the time, I didn't sit down with those pieces and create a logical career strategy. I didn't think I seemed to be interested in spirituality, teaching, and communication. So perhaps the next strategic move is seminary. Now, that's not what happened. The direction came before the explanation. And over time, my seminary experience gave me something that I did not know how to ask for when I arrived. It gave me a rich, intellectually grounded spiritual formation. It allowed me to go deeper into questions that had already been stirring within me. And it deepened my understanding of my own sense of calling. Now, that didn't mean I suddenly understood my whole life. I didn't. And it did not mean every question disappeared. They did not. But I had followed a signal that mattered. And following it changed what I was able to understand about myself. So this was the first purpose calling I consciously noticed and acted on immediately. Now, I want to be careful with that language because I'm not suggesting that everyone experiences a calling in the exact same way I did. Of course not. But this was my experience. I understood it spiritually. I experienced it as a spiritual connection and a clear direction I needed to follow. Someone else may describe a persistent inner signal differently. But what I've noticed, both in my own life and the way I think about what a purpose calling is now, is that there are sometimes things that keep returning to our attention, keep returning to our mind, an interest, a question, a pull toward a certain kind of work, a desire to serve in a certain way, a subject we can't stop thinking about. Something keeps coming back, even when we have tried to be practical or move away from it. Those signals deserve our attention. Now, not every interest requires us to change our lives. Of course not. And not every impulse is a calling. But I do believe we can become so committed to figuring everything out logically that we dismiss what's been persistently trying to get our attention. We want the 5-year plan before we take the first step. We want proof before we make a change. We want to know exactly where the road leads. But sometimes clarity does not work that way. Sometimes you're given enough clarity for the next decision, not the next 10 decisions, just the next one. So, what does this mean for you? If you're at a career crossroads right now, I want to offer you something to consider. You may be trying hard to figure out the whole story. You may be asking yourself, where is this going? What will happen if I make this decision? How does this fit with everything I've already done? Can I justify this? Will other people understand it? And all of those are reasonable questions. They really are. But there may be another question worth asking. And here's the question. What has been trying to get my attention? Not what is loudest around you, not what everyone else thinks you should do, not necessarily the thing that is easiest to explain. What keeps returning to your attention, to your mind? Is there a subject you keep coming back to, a kind of work you keep wondering about, a way of contributing that keeps pulling at you? Part of yourself that seems to become more present Every time you imagine a particular possibility, and maybe there's nothing dramatic about it, maybe it's been showing up quietly for years. And maybe you haven't taken it seriously because you just can't see how it fits into your career. And that doesn't automatically mean you should leave your job, change your life, or make a dramatic move. But perhaps it does mean the signal deserves your attention. Perhaps you don't need to force an answer yet. Perhaps you need to notice, to listen, to ask questions, to let yourself become curious about the things that seem to keep finding their way back to you. That's one of the lessons I carry from this decision. I left my beloved family, home, community, and all that nurtured me my entire life without knowing what it would lead to. I left because something in me knew I needed to go, even before I can explain why. And only later could I see how that decision deepened my spiritual formation, helped me understand my sense of calling, and became part of the path that led me toward work that included teaching, speaking, and helping other people think more deeply through their own purpose. The pattern became clear after I followed the direction, not before. When I look back now, I can see that this decision was another piece of a much larger story. At the time, I only knew I was leaving home. I didn't know how that decision would connect with the decisions that came before it or the ones that would come after. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this series of podcast episodes. Because when we look at our lives one decision at a time, we may see things that were impossible to see while we were living them. A lesson here, a signal there, a decision that seemed disconnected at the time, but later became part of a pattern. So as you think about your own life and work, I want to leave this question with you. What has been getting your attention lately that you may not fully understand yet? And keep in mind, you don't have to turn it into a plan today, and you don't have to know how to explain it, and you don't have to know where it leads. But perhaps you can begin by paying attention because sometimes the next direction becomes clear before the rest of the story does. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is trust yourself to notice. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with that for now. And if you want more like this, follow me on LinkedIn at Robin L. Owens, PhD. Feel free to message me there. I'm happy to respond to your message. And until next time, this is Dr. Robin.